Yes, you are.
There we go. Well, hello, everybody. It's time for us to sit down once again and to have a bit of a conversation with Terry and I as we break down a couple of key subjects related to the work of an evangelist. Today, we're going to be talking about planning out your preaching. And what we mean when we say that, I know at least for Terry and I both, when we began the work of an evangelist, we certainly did not really plan much beyond next Sunday. And so some of the things we're going to try to discuss and dig into are going to be ones that should be helpful and encouraging to everyone. And as we do that, we want to invite your questions. If you've got things that you want to open up and discuss with us, we'd be happy to do that. And so Terry, let's get into the heart of it. What's all this about a preaching plan? Whenever you and I bring this up, what exactly do we mean?
Well, we mean planning your preaching, and that seems to be pretty self-explanatory. Thanks for the softball question as we start off.
Sometimes you gotta have those.
It's early Tuesday. You mentioned this when we first started off. I think most of us probably just were very spontaneous in our preaching. And I can remember sometimes sitting there on Thursday going, wow, I got 2 sermons to preach on Sunday. What am I going to do? And that's a terrible way to do this, by the way. That's just a flat out awful way to do this. So what you need to do is you need to figure out in that process how you're going to plan out. And you can do it a couple of ways, but what we're talking about is just taking the time to decide what you're going to preach and when you're going to preach that. And there's some really important things to consider in all of that. And when you do that, it'll make you more effective, but it will greatly, by the way, reduce your stress. I think that's the biggest difference for me. It's just the reduction of stress about what's coming up next, as well as the increased preparation as a side kind of result of that as well.
Yeah. So from my perspective, kind of walking into the success range from the failure range, there's a couple failure points in sermon preparation that I've experienced. Failure point 1 is the topic. What am I going to talk about? And then failure point number 2 is how do I talk about the thing? And so for us right here, there's those two failure points can actually kind of be pulled off the table or at least minimized by some good group level planning. And I want to include this, that when you plan out your preaching for the year, I know that it's difficult, especially as a younger preacher with maybe a little bit less experience, a little higher anxiety about some of these things. You need to share the load of planning this stuff out with either the elders, if you're in a congregation that has good guidance in that area, or at least some of the more spiritually mature and experienced, I'm saying older guys, physically older guys, to get some feedback on what was done before you were preaching there, and remember what you've done recently, because there are certain subjects that certainly do need to be more higher on the repetition level. Like you're going to have to preach about this more regularly. Some things are going to fall into the categories of maybe less likely to be in the pulpit, but more likely to be in the Bible class. And then you can also then tailor these things to your strengths and then shift the things that you realize you're not as competent with into other parts of the basket. Maybe it's a gospel meeting. Someone comes in and addresses a subject. Maybe one of the members has a high level of expertise in an area. Okay, they're going to handle this. One of the elders has expertise in this area. But if you don't plan, that never happens. And you're constantly sliding up the mountain, sliding back down the mountain, sliding back up the mountain as you kind of scramble to figure out what to do each week. There's different levels of intentional planning. We can talk about that in a second. But at least on the first step, let's talk about, we've got kind of a simple breakdown for us intentionally. let's talk a little bit about why, a little bit more deeply about why planning like this can be beneficial to preachers of any disposition, age, or experience. Like, what kind of things come out as a plus when you start to plan?
Well, I'm reminded of an Alistair Begg quote that said, "It takes a whole Bible to make a whole Christian." And I think one of the failures of not planning is if we're not careful, we don't present the entire Bible. That we end up focusing on either, and here's the real dangers, especially when I was younger. I focused on either the hot topic of the day, so I could be easily swayed by maybe what I was reading or maybe what was going on in the news, or I could end up preaching on what I wanted to talk about, or I could end up weaponizing the pulpit and teaching on only the things I think they needed to hear to fix all of their problems.
Right.
Which, by the way, is just as bad. And we're going to talk about how you do this and the need for some flexibility, because some of those things may need to be discussed. I mean, you don't be so rigid in this that when an event like, let's say, 9/11 happens, you can't take time off to address what just happened. That would be foolish from that standpoint. Because if you don't, everybody's going to be thinking about that anyway, and then it's going to be, well, why didn't we talk about this? So, I mean, but again, this is a way to make sure you present the entire gospel to people, or the entire Bible. And I hate to even say gospel, because I think one of the things is, if you're not careful, another thing you can do is focus so much on New Testament stuff that you don't actually address the Old Testament stories or applications from there. And that's just as important, truthfully, in sharing that as the New Testament. I think sometimes we forget that. So outside of the anxiety ease for you as a preacher, the benefit and application to the church is they get a much better message shared with them on a consistent basis when you can back away and look at what you're doing from kind of a long-term planning view, and you can review that and you can say, here's my plan. So how that works for me, by the way, is I put together an annual plan. I used to do that quarterly, but I will take that to the elders and I will have them look at that, get their eyes on that as well. And they can make any recommendations that they want there and say, well, what about, we need something here. And again, that's done to make sure we're presenting the entire message that needs to be presented in that annual perspective from that standpoint. So that's the greatest, I think, principle of this, is just the ability to present a much clearer, more complete picture of the Bible on a regular basis.
Right. I know a lot of congregations, to their credit, will have 5 or 6 year Bible class curriculum plans for, mainly they kind of focus in high school and under. And some of those decisions are arbitrary and some of those decisions are structured. I think planning other things out are awesome and very, very valuable. You can use that plan to figure out where your preaching needs to be. So that there is a strength of balance coming from the pulpit. And what I mean by that, Terry talked about making sure that we're kind of, showing the whole picture. Almost always, early on in your preaching, you're going to probably find yourself leaning into the areas where you're comfortable. And for a lot of newer evangelists, very often it's New Testament, New Testament, New Testament, because for whatever reason, this seems like that's the case. And so by planning this stuff out and keeping track of those things, you can now say, okay, yeah, I know that this is my comfort zone, but I need to make sure that the brethren hear the Old Testament, not just hear it, but hear it well, that I understand it, because in 5 years, I need to be a stronger preacher than I was 5 years ago. And they need to have grown 5 years worth of maturity. I need to have grown in the same capacity. That won't happen if the only thing that I am doing is bringing in the greatest hits of my sermon repertoire on a weekly basis. Even if all the other things negatively don't happen. I don't weaponize the pulpit. I don't necessarily have bad lessons because they're ill-prepared, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I've still narrowed down the message to a thimbleful of those options. So those are some of the big pluses. And we'll talk about a few more in the planning side. Like, it's going to lower your stress because you'll know what you're going to do. It does take more work on the planning end than you might be accustomed to. And if the reason that we're kind of talking about it right now is I'm in the final stages of completing my part of the plan with the church here at Eastside, and our elders, myself and Michael, will sit down and kind of make sure it fits into the congregation's big picture of the plans so that everybody is getting a good, healthy diet of God's message every time they step into our assemblies of Bible classes or worship. So those structures kind of put a lot of pressure now. But when I hit November, because October is the planning window for us, that'll all be done. None of that stress will be made out. And so let's kind of shift gears into the how side of things. Like, how do you do this, especially if you've got, and we'll start maybe we'll pretend that we're dealing with a congregation that doesn't have elders, because a lot of guys are in that circumstance, and it might be helpful to kind of think about it that way. Where do we start in very concise and specific steps, if you will? For me, it's getting out a piece of paper. I'm old school that way. I'll get out a piece of paper and I'll start writing down some of the spiritual goals that I think are important for two parties, me, the evangelist, and then my hearers. And so what are the things that I need to hear, and what do the audience need to hear? Because that's my first thing before I go talk to anybody else. What about you, Terry?
It just depends on whether I start with paper. A lot of times I'll start with, well, I'll tell you my first step is, and this sounds kind of weird, is my first step is to pull up either Excel or Word or whatever you want to use and go ahead and develop. This is kind of just an administrative thing. Develop the table that I'm going to use with all the dates put in. And so the first thing I'll do when I do that is I'll enter in all my known absences. So my meetings that are scheduled will go in there first. Any vacations that I know about immediately will go in there first. And I do that first because that's just kind of a tedious process. It's not really planning. It's just getting the stage set so that I can plan when I get to that point. So I do that in Excel is what I've chosen to do that in. And I have essentially, I'll put all 52 weeks in, and I'll have the number of slots for sermons where I'm at now. That's one sermon a week. And I'll have the dates down. I'll black out dates that I'm gone. I'll black out dates if we have a guest speaker that I already know about. That gives me a stage to see where I'm going to go. And then my planning will start like you with what do I want to cover? What kind of goals do I have? At this point, I probably had some initial discussions with the elders about maybe a theme for the year. This year we looked at prayer, something that they're going to be involved in that planning. And so that will automatically be one Sunday a month that we've already discussed. And then next to that will be me. Now, that could be on paper. I have a marker board in my office I use a lot too, that I just write on the marker board a lot of things. And I go through that process of what's this going to look like. In my planning, what I often do a lot of times is I will tag a specific Sunday of the month to carry a certain series. For instance, this year, the first Sunday was prayer. The second Sunday, we focused on home and family. And the third Sunday, we focused on Jesus and the cross. And so what that did for me, though, by the way, because I preach once a week, is I'm essentially 3/4 of the way finished by the time that I'd set those goals, that we wanted to focus on home and family, we wanted to focus on our prayer life, and we wanted to focus on getting to know Jesus better. And that was also tied to a focus on the Lord's Supper. Yeah. So like you, that's kind of how that looked for me. I can tell you next year, one of those focus for us is going to be the minor prophet. So I'll take one Sunday a month and I'll focus on one minor prophet a month in that sermon. And that arose from a discussion with the elders. And while that's not our spiritual focus, that's going to be one of our things we do focus on. So you have to kind of set aside and establish those goals and what you need and where you want to go from that standpoint. And that's going to change based on churches. That's going to be what's best based on where you're at. Part of that, by the way, I think in this how you do that is making sure you stay balanced not only between topics but between types of sermons. For instance, we talked a couple weeks ago about textual versus topical sermons. When you don't plan like this, you will lean heavily towards whatever you're most comfortable with. If you are a textual guy, you will find yourself picking a text and just trying to force a sermon out of it because you don't know what else to do. And if you're a topical guy, you will constantly be preaching topical sermons if you don't plan. The best way to prevent that is to plan your sermons out and to know I got a mix of all of this. So in the how, that's one of my things as well. It's not just the goals of what I want them to learn, but I want a mixture of things. I don't want to be so one-sided that all my preaching is just this one thing. So I clearly, evidently, and determined not to let that happen. And I think it's important, as you put yours up there for next year, and mine's not as far along as yours, I think it's important for us to understand in the process of all of this as well, there's some things you need to plan on trying to focus on and teach on a somewhat regular basis. So, you know, you need to probably monthly have a sermon that deals with something about Christ in my thing. That's a personal thing. And that needs to point towards his life, his death, but there needs to be a somewhat of a centrally Christ-focused message on a monthly basis. There's some things I think that annually you need to talk about. I mean, annually, I'm going to probably talk about modesty at some point. That's a pretty standard, if not annually, at least once every 2 years, but almost annually. And so again, that's another one. You got to talk about authority, I think, at least once a year, and have that almost a first principle authority sermon if you can, to lay that groundwork. There's some of those things we just need to try to incorporate into that. Because what can happen if you're not careful is if you get so tied into some of the deeper things, you forget some of those new converts along the way that need some of these faith building messages of authority or Christian living and some of that stuff. So as you plan this, you kind of need to write down some categories of things that you want to kind of keep in mind of, here's some topics I need to cover along the way, and here's my plan as far as that goes. So in the how, that's kind of how I start off with is the goals, and then, okay, what are some things I've got to cover in what period of time? You've got to set those parameters yourself.
Right, and this is my approach to accomplishing some of those goals. I've got some key subjects we want to make sure are in the mix every year. We've got our big theme, which is part of the layout you see here. We've got our Bible classes because that's a big part of our congregation's assembled spiritual instruction. So they're part of here, so I can kind of see that. I like to have them on the same page. You know, I've got some times where I already know that I'll be out of town, and so those are highlighted, and someone else will be taking those responsibilities. And so I want them to have a couple of months ahead of time for this next year to kind of know, hey, you're going to need to get this subject because it fits into our theme, and we want you to teach on this while you're, in essence, in the pulpit for that particular time frame. And so I'll look at my list of things that I want to make sure are going to take place in the course of the year, and especially the ones that need to be in the sermons. And I'll ask myself, do they fit with our theme? Are they strong enough of an issue that I can put them into the clear, these are on point theme sermons? And so if that's the case, then boom, that solves that question of what I'm going to preach on that Sunday for our big theme. Does it fit into my secondary theme? Because that's how I plan things. I've got a big theme, and then I've got like a support theme to it. And so do they fit there? Am I going to cover them in the course of those sermons? And then for 2020, I've got 2 expository series that kind of fit to the needs of the congregation. We're going to be looking at Nehemiah and Galatians, and they're broken down in an even amount so that over the course of the year, we're going to have approximately 12 lessons. Now that can adjust. There's a little bit of flexibility there. I may end up not needing all 12 of those slots for Nehemiah because the sermons aren't actually written yet. All I'm doing right now is laying out the topic. And this is kind of the high point of our assembly in the middle of a Bible class to begin with and a Bible class to close out with. And so they're all part of the package. Now this year, this next year is what this looks like. 2021, I'll have the same format in the sense of classes, sermons, etc. But you're going to have different content there of what we're studying, what we're going through. But that's the next step for me, is to really put hard dates to everything. This also helps for travel planning too. Like Terry mentioned, if I'm going to be out of town and I know 2 months ahead of time, that makes somebody have a lot less stress about filling in. And some of my travels are that far out in the sense of, okay, I know I won't be here in June. I know I won't be here in February. And so they're already on the calendar. We've already got them situated. And so nobody feels an extra layer of unnecessary pressure. Hey, Terry, I've got to take this. So I'll be back shortly.
Okay. Yeah, and so as we kind of continue, one of the things that's interesting about this is just a couple of really important things about the how. If you notice there on the chart that is still up there with Phil, you'll notice that in the process of that, what Phil is showing you is color-coded. And like Phil, I do that. One of the reasons I do that is that allows me, by assigning colors to specific subjects or series or themes, it allows me to step back and kind of even look at that from a color standpoint and know what that's going to look like and know what I'm going to follow and know what I'm going to do. And that assists greatly in the planning of that. And so you need to develop your own kind of pattern and your own sort of standard diagram, for lack of a better term. Phil and I both use Excel for that. It's a great thing. A little clunkier. You could use Word if you want to and build a table within there. It's a little bit harder to do, but some people are more familiar with that. And then you can just pull that out and you can be able to go from there. A couple other topics for you to think about as you plan that out, besides maybe your theme. And if your congregation doesn't do that, I think Phil and I would both heavily recommend that you sit down with your elders and kind of come up with a theme. For us, that serves as the backbone too of our monthly small group discussions, that within our theme, I provide a list of questions in the bulletin with the outline of that sermon for our small groups to then take. And when they meet that month, they discuss that. So it serves a great purpose. We all get focused on the same thing, and we have some great discussions with each other about that. But in addition to that, some topics for you to think about on how often you're going to talk about them. For instance, I heavily recommend, like Phil has done, like I have done with the minor prophets in the past, I've just taken books of the New Testament or the Old Testament and done this. Pick a Sunday a month and go through a book. You could do that a chapter at a time, or like Phil's done, if you see there, you could do also with Galatians. And so from that standpoint, picking that kind of idea to go through something textually is a great way to do that. Other ideas to think about are, how often are you going to talk about evangelism? How often are you going to talk about dealing with sin and temptation? How often are you going to talk about God and his nature? How often are you going to talk about the church, the unity of the church, the structure of the church? Some of those things are great for Bible classes, but we need sermons on those kind of things too. So how often do we discuss those things? And if you're not careful, so one of the things you do besides your goals and besides your themes is to step back and write down kind of the points of things you think need to be covered on a regular basis by you. So if you do that, as you do that, sermon planning is where you can make sure that you hit all of those points within the time you think is appropriate. That will change. And I can tell you that even the way you plan will change. When I was preaching 2 sermons a week, I planned quarterly at first because that was easier. Then I planned 6 months. And now that I preach once a Sunday, I plan annually. And so like Phil, I'm involved in that process now of having to sit down and plan annually as far as that goes. So make sure you do that. Make sure you get with other people.
Let me sneak in real quick. So One of the things I want to mention is that this planning doesn't necessarily make the work easier across the board. It makes it more effective.
Right.
In fact, you may find that planning out these sermons requires more of you than the topical surprise sermon model you were using before.
Yeah.
But it will make you more effective, and eventually your skills will develop to the point where it's not that bad, where it's not that, you know, challenging and difficult as it once was. And so that's a big learning period, if you will, where you can learn from this process, you can learn from the steps that take place, and then eventually the seesaw kind of swings the other way, and it's a lot more of a healthy outcome and process.
Yeah, because when I was planning my sermons every Thursday, I didn't have enough time to do a good job like I do now, because I know what's coming up 6 months from now. And so if I'm reading something and I know that's something I'm going to preach on, then this planning and preparation for the sermons, because of my schedule, is a lot longer planning time, and it's a lot deeper, and it's a lot more effective that way. You cannot do that when you're just planning things and you have essentially 36 hours to write a sermon or two. It just doesn't work as well. One thing I would add to this that I've done before, we all read all the time, and sometimes that's even blog post or a book or whatever it may be. One thing that I would highly recommend in regards to this is keeping what I would call like a hot topics folder on your computer. If it's a book, you can just take some notes and type it out, or you can scan it in. If it's a blog post, you can cut and paste it and save it or make a PDF of it, so that when you plan again, and if that's every 3 months, if that's every year, you may have read something that you think is a really good either supplement, or maybe it's even a really good idea you want to develop into a message. So a lot of times when I start planning, if I'm not in a series and I just kind of have flexible Sundays, I'll pull up my hot topics folder and look at, oh yeah, I wanted to talk about this. And so you're collecting, and that's where truthfully, even though right now I'm starting my planning phase and I'll be done by the end of October as well, in a very realistic standpoint, I've been planning for a year by not only thinking about what kind of series, but also collecting different topics that I want to incorporate and having kind of a catalog of things to look at and go through. So that just adds another layer to the preparation for you, so that you can kind of be ready for all of that.
And I'll say, I don't know about you, because you had a structured mentorship relationship to a certain degree at different parts in your development. Some of this stuff was simply not part of my process of this back end level of research, because I just didn't know. It wasn't because I wasn't able or capable. It was like a high level of individual ignorance. So now what? I also do this kind of planning, by the way, whenever I'm asked to speak somewhere on a special topic of some kind. If I know 6 months out before the meeting, I'm going to put all my effort into getting them my topics by their request line, what they want to do, at least 6 months out. If they know, I want them to know what I'm going to do. It helps them with their publication of the event. But then I guarantee you my work will be more effective because I've had that much more time to generate the best quality material for those times. And Terry and I have busy lives. We've got kids, we've got congregational obligations, we have service roles in the community. If we don't do this kind of planning, then everybody around us suffers in the pit of despair that comes an overworked person. There's no good outcomes at those times. And so there's a lot of good reasons that you can take all these how parts together and build them. Let me offer a couple of suggestions on the practical level, especially, again, going back to that brand new guy, first time work, no shepherds. We didn't talk about this in great detail. Once you have these things kind of drafted out, one, don't be married to them like you're never going to divorce from those ideas. But secondly, go to those already identified congregationally close proximal people and say, what does this look like? Did I miss something? And have enough desire to do a good job to be humble about it, so they'll be able to tell you, we need something here and you didn't have it, and go, cool, what is it? How can we fit that in? And bring it in. I guarantee you the result will be better when you share the process. You want those elders involved if you had them. If you don't, then work with what you got. And then once you identify those things, there is a number of resources and tools. And I'm just going to highlight some, like a lot of great commentaries, especially like if they're textual commentaries, are actually laid out in chapter format. And you'll notice this magic thing where there's 11 to 13 chapters as they break down the text, because the text kind of fits into these annual work for the guys who actually wrote the book. And so you may not use their titles, you might not use their breakdowns, but you can profit from seeing how they segmented out the text as a very starting structure point. And so before you even sit down to write the sermon, because you should have already read the scriptures, you should have already done some background research, you should have already done some historical research to think about when was this preached, when was this written. Now you have a structure that you can say, do I like it or not like it? You may hate it and not use it. You may love it and say, that's great. It makes your work more efficient and more effective, because in the end, you're going to get up and preach. But this is all the back end stuff that kind of clears up these steps.
Let me tell you, one of the great benefits of this, and we're going to have a hard cutoff here in just a minute. One of the great benefits of this, by the way, is when it comes to preaching, there's always this question about what do we do? And how much time do we put in and all of that kind of stuff. And that's we talked about doing a video on a day in the life of the preacher and kind of peeling back some of that. But I'll say this, nothing, especially without elders, I think few things would show your diligence, your planning, and your work ethic than going in, in October or November to whatever style of organization, whether that's a congregational meeting, men's business meeting, whatever it is, and saying, hey, I have the next year planned out. I want you to see this is where we're going. It shows a diligence on your part. It shows an idea of planning. It shows a level of professionalism that it's hard for people to make accusations about. And quite frankly, as a preacher, especially a young preacher, you need to remove any doubts you can along the way. And that's one of the great benefits of this as well.
Right. And let me add this from a personal standpoint. BJ's got a question we're going to answer in a second. While I did this kind of preparation on my own and with the shepherds at my prior work, one thing we did not do, and I certainly didn't do after the eldership dissolved, was to share this with the men in a healthy way. Some of that was my anxiety and my fears. Some of that was not piecing together the bits and pieces of how valuable that would be. And so really that sharing ahead of time helps people understand that the work behind the sermon is legitimate, difficult, challenging work. All right, so BJ has got a question for us. How would you recommend floating the idea of being more purposeful in planning out the work in the congregation that does have established leadership that isn't used to this approach to doing the work? All right, so I'll give my tidbit answer and Terry can follow in. We've got a few more minutes than I planned, so we should be good. But from my perspective, the first thing I would do is, if they expect you to handle the preaching planning already, like they want you to basically pick your sermons, there's nothing stopping you from picking your sermons now and coming to them and saying, hey, this is what I'm thinking of doing in 2020. That's like the first step of it. If they have an input regularly on your sermons, then sit down and say, hey, I'm trying to make my work more effective. This is the thing I'm thinking about. This is what I've already kind of hand drafted together. It's just a draft. It's not permanent. It's not perfect. What do you think? What's your insight? Give me some guidance. Give me some wisdom. Bring something into the table a little bit so that I can see where things are at. And so I would come probably a little bit with hat in hand and saying, give me some of the insight that comes from your side of the leadership table. And here's what I'm bringing to you. And so I would probably start with that big question. Are you already required to do this anyway? And generally, most guys are. They're the ones picking their sermons every Sunday. So there's nothing stopping you from having a plan and saying, this is what I'm going to do. They might not like it. So talk to them before you do it, like before you actually enact the plan. Terry?
I think that's the key. Is there's there's nothing stopping you from planning this and explaining, hey, I still got flexibility here, but this is my idea. I think what BJ may be getting at is more of the annual theme kind of things that we've mentioned, perhaps, and maybe more of a congregational purpose. And I can tell you when I started that, where I was at, what we did was I just simply went to the elders and said, I would like to take one Sunday a month and focus on a topic that we could present as an annual theme to this congregation to show planning and preparation on our part as leadership. And so I would love to hear your ideas of what you'd want to cover in that. And then I would come back and after that discussion, we would settle on something, or maybe even right then. So I asked for their buy-in to get that started. And I wanted their buy-in because, as Hal's just kind of mentioned, in his experience, elders have pretty much no opinion about what you do and when you do it. I think that's a multifaceted issue, by the way, of why elders are that way. But I found that if you try to include elders, I don't think that they're opposed to that.
Right.
I think that's the key to that. So you just have to ask for their buy-in, and then I think it's good to prepare it and to go in and say, here it is, and I'd like for you to just kind of see this and understand where I'm headed. Because again, even with elders, it shows you are working and planning, and you're strategic and you're professional in how you approach this, and you're taking your job seriously rather than just showing up like I did, quite frankly, and Thursday trying to figure out what I'm going to preach. I mean, quite frankly, if I was an elder, I would not be satisfied with the 24-year-old Terry Francis version. I'm glad that they were patient in that sense. But this helps me approach my work with a much greater sense of seriousness and maturity, and quite frankly, the work ethic the job deserves.
Yes.
And I think that's one of the things to keep in mind. Our work deserves this kind of effort and planning. It deserves that. It deserves more than that, but it certainly deserves this.
And to kind of package these things, once you come into that meeting with a plan of some kind laid out, like this is what I'd like to do, and you're willing to work around things that are included in the conversation that maybe you didn't already know about, things that they're going to ask of you at gospel meetings, you're going to also end up building a great relationship with those shepherds, and so I think that's a real benefit to all of this. And so in all of that, there's some great open doors to strengthen the flock too, and you'll get better through the process. Again, building a good mentorship with those shepherds, they'll be more likely to incline their ear to your requests. They still might not agree with you or want to do what you're saying, but the conversations get easier and easier. You grow through in that process. Let's go ahead. I know I got some things I've got to take care of. Terry does too. We're going to pause the conversation because we both have some things on the agenda today that we really kind of need to take care of. But we'll come back into this. I think upcoming conversations so people can kind of plan ahead. We're going to talk about the day in the life of a preacher. We're going to be discussing the appointing of elders and some of the challenges to that task. It's not easy. I think for that conversation, we may even have Terry talk about the preacher's side, and I can talk about being the pincushion side, because I will tell you, of everything I have done in life, with the exclusion of, I will say, a few key events and raising children through that process, being appointed as a shepherd was the most unifyingly humbling event in my life. And it wasn't that anyone was intentionally hard on me. They were actually quite gracious and kind to the entire process. But if you think through the process, there's a lot of internal self-reflection that needs to take place. And you could probably talk to my wife and to others that I'm different now. And I'm trying to continue to be different because of what I learned in that process. Terry, last thoughts from you?
Just, if anybody needs any help kind of getting started with this, or they want to bounce off ideas, feel free to send us a private message either to the page or personally. I was with a guy last weekend and talked about our work on this page, and just wanted to make sure people know we're here to help you any way we can. And so just reach out to us, and we want to be your friend. and we want to be your help in any way possible and encourage you in every way possible. We hope these things encourage you.
Yeah. And one last thing, Terry and I will talk about this in the future too. That we're probably going to sit down and talk about how these conversations have changed Terry and I, because I know that they've changed me, and I'm sure that it's changed him. And so that's some of the things coming up that we've planned out. But if you've got topics, we'll insert those in the mix because we're not rigidly assigning those to our steps. Everybody have a great day, and may the Lord bless you in all that you are accomplishing His work. And if we can help you, like Terry said, let us know. Take care, everybody.